It all began on what seemed like an ordinary afternoon, but no one could have predicted the tragedy that would follow. Aid and his wife, Ifeoma, had been married for 5 years, building a life together that seemed peaceful from the outside. But beneath the surface, tension was brewing between Ifeoma and Aid's younger sister, Kemi. Kemi had never fully accepted Ifeoma into the family, believing that she was a danger to her brother. On a quiet day, the conflict between the two women reached its peak. Kemi, convinced she was saving her brother from what she saw as a harmful relationship, took matters into her own hands. What began as an argument between the two escalated into something far more deadly. In a moment of rage, Kemi killed Ifeoma in her own home, believing that she was protecting her brother from a dangerous woman. The police were called, and Inspector Yusuf arrived at the scene, trying to piece together what had happened. What could have driven Kemi to commit such a violent act? Was Ifeoma truly the villain Kemi had painted her to be, or was Kemi's overprotectiveness the real cause of the tragedy? As we uncover the events leading up to this shocking crime, we'll explore how a family's loyalty and trust were torn apart by a sister's belief that she knew best. This is the heartbreaking story of how one woman's protective instinct ended in a brutal murder, leaving everyone involved shattered and searching for answers. Aid and Ifeoma had been happily married for 5 years. Their relationship had always seemed stable, and from the outside they looked like the perfect couple. But beneath the surface, trouble was brewing, trouble that neither of them had fully understood until it was too late. The source of this trouble was Kemi, Aid's younger sister. Kemi and Aid had always been close, with Kemi believing it was her responsibility to protect her brother from harm, even if that harm came from someone as close as his own wife. Kemi had never approved of Ifeoma. She had made it clear from the beginning that she didn't trust her. To Kemi, Ifeoma was an outsider, someone who had come between her and her brother. Over the years, Kemi had convinced herself that Ifeoma was manipulative and dangerous, and as time passed, this belief grew stronger. She had no proof, but Kemi's suspicions were enough to fuel an ongoing tension in the family. At family gatherings, the tension between Kemi and Ifeoma was always present. Ifeoma tried to ignore Kemi's passive-aggressive remarks and constant meddling in her marriage, but it became harder as the years went by. Aid, stuck between his sister and his wife, often found himself trying to play peacemaker, but his efforts only seemed to make things worse. He loved his sister, but he loved his wife too, and he couldn't understand why Kemi wouldn't accept Ifeoma as part of their family. The real trouble began when Kemi's obsession with protecting Aid from his wife took a darker turn. Kemi began visiting Aid in Ifeoma's home more frequently, often without warning, to check up on her brother. She would criticize Ifeoma's every move, from how she cooked to how she treated Aid. Ifeoma, for her part, tried to keep the peace, but her patience was wearing thin. She had reached her breaking point, but she didn't want to cause a rift in the family by confronting Kemi directly. Aid, sensing the growing tension, began to distance himself from both women. He would often stay late at work or find reasons to avoid being at home when Kemi visited. He thought that avoiding the conflict would help, but instead, it only fueled Kemi's suspicions that Ifeoma was driving a wedge between them. In Kemi's mind, Ifeoma was controlling Aid, turning him against his own family, and she couldn't stand by and watch it happen any longer. It was during one of these unannounced visits that the situation took a deadly turn. Kemi arrived at Aid and Ifeoma's house one evening, uninvited, as usual. Aid wasn't home, but Ifeoma was. What started as a minor argument between the two women quickly escalated into a full-blown confrontation. Kemi accused Ifeoma of manipulating Aid and destroying their family. Ifeoma, exhausted by years of Kemi's constant interference, finally snapped and fought back verbally, defending herself and her marriage. The argument became heated, with neither woman willing to back down. In the heat of the moment, Kemi's long-held anger and suspicion boiled over. She grabbed a kitchen knife from the counter, and in a fit of rage, she attacked Ifeoma. Ifeoma fought back, but she was no match for Kemi's fury. The struggle lasted only minutes, but by the time it was over, Ifeoma lay motionless on the kitchen floor, a pool of blood spreading around her. Kemi, breathing heavily and still holding the knife, stood frozen in shock at what she had done. Her hands were covered in blood, and the realization of her actions slowly began to sink in. She had killed her brother's wife. In her mind, she had done it to protect Aid, to save him from a woman she believed was dangerous. But as she looked at Ifeoma's lifeless body, she wasn't so sure anymore. Panic set in as Kemi tried to figure out what to do next. She quickly cleaned the knife and placed it back on the counter, hoping to erase any evidence of her involvement. She thought about leaving the house and pretending she had never been there, but the blood on her clothes and the shock in her eyes would give her away. Instead, she picked up the phone and called AD, telling him to come home immediately. She didn't tell him why, only that something terrible had happened. When Aid arrived, he was met with a sight that would haunt him for the rest of his life. His wife, Ifeoma, was dead, and his sister, Kemi, stood nearby, trembling and unable to speak. He didn't understand what had happened at first, but the look on Kemi's face told him everything he needed to know. His own sister had killed his wife. The police were called, and within minutes, the house was swarming with officers. Inspector Yusuf, a seasoned detective, arrived to take control of the scene. As he began his investigation, Kemi was taken into custody. She claimed she had been protecting her brother from a dangerous woman, but the evidence told a different story. Ifeoma had been the victim of an act of rage, not a calculated plan to save anyone. The investigation would reveal the deep-rooted tensions that had built up over the years, leading to this tragic outcome. Kemi's overprotectiveness, combined with her growing paranoia about Ifeoma, had driven her to commit the unthinkable. Now the lives of everyone involved were shattered, and the question remained, was this an act of misguided love, or had Kemi's obsession with control turned her into the real danger? The crime scene was a mess of emotions and blood, with AD caught between grief for his wife and confusion over his sister's actions. As Inspector Yusuf prepared to dig deeper into the case, he knew that the road ahead would be filled with painful revelations and the unraveling of a family torn apart by mistrust and violence. As the investigation into Ifeoma's murder continued, the details of Kemi's mindset started to emerge, revealing a deeper, more disturbing pattern of behavior. For years, Kemi had been silently harboring resentment toward her brother's wife. This jealousy and protectiveness had grown stronger with time, transforming into something more dangerous than anyone had realized. Kemi had always felt that her brother Ed was slipping away from her. She had raised him after their parents passed away when they were both young, and in her mind, she believed that no one could ever take care of him the way she did. Kemi's protectiveness wasn't just about family, it had become an obsession. In her eyes, Ifeoma was a threat. She believed that Ifeoma was manipulating Aid, controlling his life, and isolating him from his family. These thoughts began to dominate Kemi's mind, clouding her judgment. She became convinced that if she didn't intervene, her brother would lose everything, and that he would be ruined by Ifeoma. As she spiraled deeper into her paranoia, Kemi began to see Ifeoma in a more sinister light. She interpreted every action, every word as a sign of malice. When Ifeoma invited Kemi over for family dinners, Kemi believed it was just a facade to keep her close, so Ifeoma could control her too. She felt that Ifeoma was always plotting, always trying to cut Aid off from his roots, and Kemi couldn't stand by and let that happen. These delusions festered for years, with Kemi seeing herself as the only one who truly understood what was happening. Her belief in her role as her brother's protector intensified to the point where she started imagining scenarios where Ifeoma was actively harming Aid. She convinced herself that her brother was too blind to see the truth, and if no one else could see it, then it was her responsibility to save him. The people around Kemi, her friends and colleagues, noticed her growing obsession, but no one imagined it would lead to something deadly. To them, Kemi was just a concerned sister, but Kemi's thoughts had crossed a dangerous line long before she picked up that knife. The night of the murder, Kemi acted on pure emotion, driven by the belief that she was doing the right thing. In her twisted view of the world, Ifeoma had manipulated AD so thoroughly that the only way to free him was to eliminate her from his life entirely. She had convinced herself that Ifeoma was beyond redemption, and that her death would be the only way to save AD from a lifetime of misery and manipulation. During the police interviews, Kemi remained calm, almost cold, as she recounted the events leading up to the murder. She didn't show much remorse, because in her mind she hadn't done anything wrong. She truly believed that Ifeoma's death was a necessary step in saving her brother. Inspector Yusuf, seasoned as he was, had seen cases of delusion and obsession before, but Kemi's lack of guilt was particularly chilling. AD, on the other hand, was devastated. His wife was gone, and the person responsible was his own sister, the one person he had trusted his entire life. He couldn't comprehend how Kemi had convinced herself that killing Ifeoma was the answer to their problems. As Adi spoke with investigators, his confusion was palpable. He had always known Kemi was protective, but he never imagined it could escalate to this level. He was torn between grief for his wife and the shock of what his sister had done. His world had crumbled in a matter of hours, and now he faced the impossible task of coming to terms with the actions of the two women he had loved most in his life. Kemi's mental state became a key point in the investigation. She had no prior criminal record, no history of violence, and by all accounts she had been a dedicated sister and a responsible member of society, but the cracks in her mind had been widening for years, unnoticed by everyone around her. The investigators pieced together Kemi's deteriorating mental state through interviews with friends and family. Everyone had seen the small signs of jealousy, but no one had ever imagined that it would lead to murder. As Inspector Yusuf delved deeper into the case, he realized that Kemi's motive wasn't fueled by anger or hatred. It was fueled by a twisted sense of duty. She believed that she was the hero of the story, the one who had to step in and save her brother from a life of misery. But her warped perspective had blinded her to the reality of what she had done. In trying to protect her brother, she had destroyed his life. Inspector Yusuf and his team began piecing together the events of the murder. The crime scene had already told part of the story of Ai's lifeless body on the kitchen floor and the blood-stained knife nearby, with Kemi confessing to the act. However, it was clear that this case went deeper than a simple act of violence. Inspector Yusuf needed to understand the dynamics of the relationships involved to uncover the true motive behind the murder. Interviews with friends, family, and neighbors revealed more about the toxic relationship that had been simmering between Ai and Kemi. While Adi had remained mostly neutral, the tension between his wife and sister had been noticeable to everyone. What began as minor disagreements had gradually escalated into something far more dangerous. Kemi's friends noted that she had spoken about her concerns regarding Ai, but no one had taken her words seriously enough to believe that she would resort to violence. Adi, devastated by the loss of his wife, could barely bring himself to speak during the interviews. He was in shock, unable to comprehend how his sister, whom he had always trusted, could have committed such a heinous act. His relationship with Kemi had been one of deep affection, but now he was forced to confront the fact that his sister had killed the woman he loved. Inspector Yusuf could see the pain in Adi's eyes, a man caught between grief for his wife and confusion over his sister's actions. The investigation revealed that Kemi had been obsessed with the idea that Ai was manipulating Ade. Her protectiveness had turned into a dangerous fixation. The team found old text messages between Kemi and her friends where she frequently spoke about her suspicions that Ai was a harmful influence on her brother. Kemi had written at length about how she believed Ai was driving a wedge between her and Ade, isolating him from his family. She often described herself as the only one who could protect her brother from this threat. These messages painted a picture of a woman whose paranoia had slowly taken over her life. While Kemi had no history of violence, her obsession with controlling Ade's life and her deep-rooted hatred for Ai had clearly been building for years. Her friends and family described Kemi as loyal and protective, but no one had expected these traits to morph into something dangerous. As Inspector Yusuf continued the investigation, it became clear that the night of the murder had been a breaking point. Kemi had arrived at Ade and Ai's home unannounced, as she often did. When she confronted Ai that night, her fears and frustrations had boiled over into a violent confrontation. Kemi had snapped, unable to hold back the anger that had been festering inside her for so long. The argument turned physical, and Kemi, in a moment of uncontrollable rage, had taken Ai's life. The team spoke with several neighbors who had heard the shouting that night. One neighbor recalled hearing Kemi's voice raised in anger, followed by a scream. By the time they had realized something was wrong, it was already too late. Kemi had killed Ai in what she believed was an act of protection for her brother, but it was clear to everyone else that Kemi's actions had been driven by her own delusions. Inspector Yusuf knew that Kemi's mental state would play a critical role in the upcoming trial. While her obsession with protecting Ade had led her to believe that she was doing the right thing, the evidence pointed to a deeply disturbed mind. Kemi had crossed the line from concern to control, and her inability to see reality had cost Ai her life. The prosecutor began building a case based on Kemi's deteriorating mental health. They argued that her actions were premeditated, driven by years of resentment and jealousy. Kemi's fixation on her brother and her belief that Ai was a danger had pushed her to commit murder. However, Kemi's defense team took a different approach. They argued that Kemi had acted out of love for her brother and that her mental state had clouded her judgment. As the investigation came to a close, the trial date was set, and the courtroom would soon become the stage for the final chapter in this tragic story. Inspector Yusuf reflected on the case, knowing that justice needed to be served, but also understanding the complexity of human emotions that had led to this tragedy. Kemi's love for her brother had turned deadly, and now the truth would have to be laid bare in court. As the trial for Kemi's murder of I began, the tension in the courtroom was palpable. This was not just a case of homicide, it was a family torn apart by violence, paranoia, and deep-rooted emotions. The media had caught wind of the story, labeling it as a tragic tale of a sister's love turned deadly. But as the court proceedings got underway, the question remained, was Kemi truly delusional, or had she acted out of a calculated sense of control? The prosecutor opened the case by laying out the facts in a clear, methodical manner. If I had been a victim, murdered in her own home by her sister-in-law, the evidence against Kemi was irrefutable: the knife, her own confession, and the history of animosity between her and Fi. But while the physical evidence painted a clear picture of the crime, it was Kemi's state of mind that would become the focal point of the trial. Kemi sat in the courtroom, emotionless, as if detached from the events unfolding around her. Her defense attorney focused on her mental state, arguing that she had been suffering from delusions that led her to believe Fi was a danger to her brother. They argued that Kemi's intentions were not malicious but were instead born out of an overwhelming sense of duty to protect her family. They presented a psychological evaluation that diagnosed Kemi with paranoia, claiming that this illness had driven her actions. The defense sought to prove that she was not in control of her actions when she killed I, and that she had genuinely believed her brother was in danger. Throughout the trial, Aid remained a key figure, though he struggled with the pain of losing both his wife and his sister in the same violent act. As he took the stand to testify, his grief was evident. He recounted the events leading up to the murder and described the growing tension between his wife and his sister. Edie spoke of how he had been caught in the middle, torn between two women he loved, but unable to foresee the tragedy that was about to unfold. The prosecution cross-examined Aid, focusing on the fact that despite the tension, there had been no evidence that Fi had ever posed any actual threat to Kemi or Aid. They argued that Kemi's obsession had gone unchecked for years, and that it had finally culminated in a violent act of jealousy. The prosecutor painted Kemi as a woman who had become consumed by her own paranoia and had used that as an excuse to commit murder. As the trial moved forward, the prosecution presented witness after witness who described Kemi's increasing isolation and erratic behavior. Her friends spoke about how she had distanced herself from everyone, fixating solely on her brother's marriage. Neighbors who had heard the argument on the night of the murder testified that Kemi had seemed furious, her voice filled with rage as she confronted Fi. The image that emerged was not one of a woman simply protecting her brother, but of someone who had become obsessed with controlling his life. However, the defense countered with their psychological experts, who argued that Kemi's mental state had deteriorated over time. They pointed to the years of unresolved grief after their parents' death, which had left Kemi feeling solely responsible for Aid's well-being. They claimed that this, combined with her untreated paranoia, had created a delusional belief that Fi was a threat to her brother. The defense painted Kemi as a tragic figure, someone who had lost her way and whose love for her brother had ultimately led to her downfall. As the days passed, the courtroom became a battleground of emotions. Friends and family sat in the gallery, watching as the events that had torn their lives apart were laid bare for all to see. Kemi's blank expression throughout the trial only added to the mystery of her true motivations. Was she truly unaware of the gravity of her actions, or was this part of a calculated attempt to avoid responsibility for her crime? Inspector Yusuf, who had led the investigation, also took the stand. He provided a detailed account of the evidence collected, from the blood-stained knife to the messages that Kemi had sent to her friends. His testimony added weight to the argument that this murder was not a spur-of-the-moment act, but the culmination of years of festering jealousy and paranoia. He explained that while Kemi's love for her brother was clear, it had crossed the line into something far more dangerous. As the trial neared its conclusion, both sides prepared for their final arguments. The prosecution maintained that Kemi was fully aware of her actions and had acted out of jealousy and control. The defense, however, continued to argue that her mental illness had driven her to believe she was saving her brother from a life of manipulation and harm. The jury would soon be faced with the difficult task of determining whether Kemi was a cold-blooded killer or a woman who had been undone by her own mind. The trial was a test of not only justice but also the complexities of human emotion. Both the prosecution and the defense had made compelling arguments, but only one truth would prevail in the courtroom. As the final day of the trial approached, the courtroom buzzed with anticipation. Both sides had made compelling arguments, and now the fate of Kemi lay in the hands of the jury. Kemi sat motionless, her face pale and expressionless, as if she were already resigned to whatever was to come. AD, seated behind the defense, was visibly torn as grief for his wife and the confusion over his sister's actions clear in his eyes. The courtroom was packed with friends, family, and members of the public, all waiting for the trial's resolution. The judge entered, calling the court to order. The jurors filed in one by one, their expressions giving nothing away. After weeks of hearing testimony and reviewing evidence, they had reached a decision. As the foreperson rose to speak, the tension in the room was almost unbearable. The jury found Kemi guilty of second-degree murder. They acknowledged the defense's argument regarding her mental state, but they could not overlook the fact that she had taken Afai's life with full knowledge of her actions. While Kemi's mental illness played a part in the crime, it was clear that her obsession with controlling her brother's life had gone too far. The judge sentenced her to a significant term in prison, with the possibility of parole after several years, given her mental health condition. The courtroom erupted into a mix of reactions. Aid remained seated, his face blank as the weight of the verdict settled over him. He had lost both his wife and his sister in the same tragic event. Kemi was led away by officers, her head down, her future now tied to the consequences of her actions. The rest of the family, seated quietly in the gallery, could only watch as the woman they once knew as a loving sister and daughter was now convicted of murder. Outside the courthouse, the media swarmed, eager for a statement. This case had gripped the community, drawing attention due to the tragic family dynamic and the shocking nature of the crime. Reporters detailed the events that had led to this moment, a sister's misguided sense of duty turning into a deadly obsession. The public response was mixed. Some sympathized with Kemi, believing that her mental health had truly driven her to act out of fear for her brother. Others saw her as a dangerous woman who had crossed the line and taken an innocent life. AD, however, remained silent. He had no words for the cameras, no explanation for the events that had destroyed his family. For him, the trial might be over, but the pain of losing his wife and his sister would never fade. His life had been shattered, and no verdict or sentence could ever bring back what he had lost. Over the following weeks, the family tried to piece together what had happened, but there were no easy answers. They could not explain why Kemi's obsession had spiraled out of control, nor could they reconcile the woman they loved with the one who had committed such a terrible crime. As time passed, the community moved on, though the story of Kemi's actions and the trial remained a topic of conversation for years. In prison, Kemi began receiving treatment for her mental illness. Doctors worked with her to understand the extent of her paranoia and the delusions that had fueled her actions. Though she remained detached, the slow process of therapy revealed just how deeply her belief in protecting Aid had consumed her. She often asked about her brother, seeking reassurance that he was safe, still convinced that she had done what was necessary. The professionals working with her knew that her road to recovery would be long and complicated, but they hoped that one day Kemi would truly understand the consequences of her actions. Meanwhile, AD faced the difficult task of rebuilding his life. He visited Kemi a few times in prison, though the conversations were strained. He still loved his sister, despite what she had done, but he could not forget the pain her actions had caused. He lived with the constant reminder of Ifai's absence, the emptiness in his home and his heart. Friends and family tried to support him, but no one could fully comprehend the extent of his loss. As the years passed, the case faded from the headlines, but the impact remained. The story of Kemi's crime became a cautionary tale of how unchecked mental illness and obsession could destroy lives. It served as a reminder that love, when twisted by delusion and control, could become a dangerous force. The trial, though over, left a scar on the community and the family. It was a tragic story with no real winners. Kemi was behind bars, receiving the help she needed but forever haunted by what she had done. AD carried the burden of grief and loss, his life forever changed by the actions of the sister he had once trusted. The courtroom drama had ended, but the aftermath of the crime would linger in their hearts for years to come.